So on June the 19th, 1937, there was mass uprisings down in the south of Trinidad, Faizabad. And Uriah Butler's influence was becoming so powerful. And all of that was part of the divide and rule trick against African people when it comes to our Caribbean brothers and sisters. So look at it. Uriah Butler, hero in Trinidad, was born in Grenada. Clement Payne, hero in Trinidad, was of Bayesian descent, and even though he was born on the island of Trinidad, key colleague of Uriah Butler, he was deported to Barbados. And Elma Francois, the head of the Negro Women's Association, she was born in St. Vincent. So these three key leaders of the labor struggle in Trinidad and Tobago, one born in Grenada, one Bayesian, one born in St. Vincent, and then they now, the enemy, sitting back looking at this matrix of African Caribbean unity, said, no, we have to do something about that. And then they started to deport, imprison, arrest, and promote this negative, toxic, self-hating ideology that you're from a bigger island. So that somehow makes you better than your brother or sister from a smaller island. Wow. Well, I'm hoping that that's an outdated mode of thinking, but we have so much that we can learn on this relatively big island of Trinidad from our brothers and sisters on a lot of the other smaller islands. So June 19th, 1937, in Faizabad, Uriah Butler is raising up the spirit and the consciousness of the people. Then the white police looking by say, no, we cannot have, and they've always said, we must not have a black man with that kind of power to move black people into action. So they made an attempt to arrest Uriah Butler. The crowd moved in, and one particular white police officer who tried to seize him, the people got involved, prevented them from arresting Uriah Butler. They doused gasoline on that one policeman, whose name was Charlie King, set him on fire. Now later on, the junction there in Faizabad was named after him, the white man, Charlie King Junction. But they didn't catch Uriah Butler. And Charlie King died, and a massive search party went out for Uriah Butler. They couldn't find him. Looked everywhere, raided homes, kicked down doors all over the Southland. Couldn't find him anywhere. And the people were agitated by this. So the next day, June 20th, the colonial administration mobilized additional forces and actually asked people to volunteer. It was a national manhunt to try to get Uriah Butler. Next day, June 21st, they swore in special constables within the local police force, and they requested troops urgently from overseas. Because this situation was getting out of control, the influence that Uriah Butler had was too great, and they feared him. So their manhunt continued. And then the next day, on June 22nd, 2 battleship cruisers landed on the shores of Trinidad. Look how far away England is. They made the request on June 20th. 2 battleships were in Trinidad by June 22nd. The Her Majesty's ship, or HMS Ajax, and Her Majesty's ship Exeter. And this is why, beloved, they have all of these overseas military bases in foreign countries. So England is all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, but right next door in Barbados, they have a military base. In Guyana, they have a military base. In Grenada, they have a military base. In St. Vincent, St. Lucia, St. Kitts, Antigua, they have military bases. And then they employing us. We just want a loaf of bread, some milk, something to eat, and a place to live. So they hire us in their armies to fight their cause, even if it means oppressing our own. So these battleships arrived in Trinidad on June 22nd, and by June 29th, the colonial authorities declared that they now have the situation of unrest in Trinidad and Tobago under control. But it was not until September 27th that Uriah Butler came out of hiding. And it's understood that if he wanted to stay in exile, he could have. So Uriah Butler, now seen as this dangerous man. But they realized it wasn't just about him. Remember, while this was happening in Trinidad, you had all of these other Caribbean nations with this unrest and uprising. So in Black Studies, we give the whole, in chapter 3, list of the Caribbean rebellions and uprisings. Just to touch on some of them really quickly: Trelawney, Jamaica, May 21st, 1935. There was a strike of the port workers developed into a riot. Strikebreakers came in, workers were threatened. One worker was killed by police. Again, 1935, the Jamaica Permanent Development Convention, a Marcus Garvey organization, held a public meeting and it announced plans for the formation of a labor union. Of course, the Jamaica Labour Party emerged out of the trade union. That's another point that I want to make. But St. Kitts, January 28, 1935, the King Cutters refused to start reaping the new sugar crop on the Shadwell plantation. News of their refusal to work spread across the island. Stones were thrown. Manager fired his gun into the crowd. Several workers were injured. Armed police arrived, but workers refused to disperse, demanding that the manager be arrested. And the crowd grew to 500 people. The riot act was read, and the military fired into the crowd. In Barbados, July 27th, famous day, but 1937, a large crowd gathered in downtown Bridgetown, marching against British imperialism. Shop windows were smashed, cars were pushed into the sea, police patrols fled, and there was a hail of bottles and stones against the white police officers. Same thing, October 21st, 1935, in St. Vincent. An angry crowd armed with sticks and stones gathered in Kingstown to inform the governor of their grievances about lack of employment and poverty. They broke the windows of the courthouse, smashed and damaged motor cars. Following the arrival of an armed police force, the riot act was read and the crowd was fired upon. Notice that pattern. 1935, in St. Lucia, there was a strike of the coal loaders. The governor mobilized the local military force, called upon the British government for reinforcements. A warship was quickly on the scene, and for several days and nights, Marines patrolled the streets of the capital, Castries, and some of the rural areas, looking for those who were involved in the labor revolutionary activity. In Guyana, on the plantation Leonora, there was a strike in September 1934, followed by a strike on the plantation Utflut, during which 2,000 workers prevented the start of mining operations. In Belize, as I mentioned earlier, the Unemployed Brigade, February 1934, emerged in Belize town. And a protest march of 3,000 marched on the city. And all of these rebellions, all across the Caribbean, happening during that same period, 100 years up from slavery, 100 years celebrating emancipation. Remember, in Trinidad and Tobago in 1888, there was a massive movement to make Emancipation Day a public holiday, headed by that great attorney, Edgar Murray Smith, and Emmanuel Mzumbo Lazare, and some of the brilliant visionaries from as far back as then, according to the teachings of Dr. Tony Martin. But think, though, all of this inspiring black history, all of these revolutionary movements, all of these African workers who were sensitive to the conditions of exploitation taking place in their countries. And while the British were in touch with each other, because remember, each of these countries where they called for reinforcements, the reinforcements didn't have to come from across the Atlantic Ocean. The reinforcements came from right next door, where they had more of their people in military bases. Can't we learn something from that regarding our unity? we are in such large numbers. They were and are in such small numbers. But when there's trouble, they call in their reinforcements from nearby. And just a little bit of them in all these different pockets coming together as a force, they can strengthen their presence. Meanwhile, you and I, in the majority, are weaker because of our ideological differences and divisions and the fact that we point out the negative side of what we see as our diversity.